There was a moment in the early 20th century when bread stopped being bread. Not all at once, not with an announcement, just quietly behind factory doors. In the language of efficiency and progress, the thing people had made in their homes for thousands of years became something else. And by the time anyone thought to ask what had changed, an entire generation had already grown up believing the new version was the original. This isn't about bread. It's about what happens when a food system decides that nutrition is negotiable. In 1910, 90% of American households baked their own bread. By 1960, 90% bought it pre-sliced from a store. That shift didn't happen because people suddenly forgot how to bake. It happened because industrial milling had made something faster, cheaper, and whiter than anything a home oven could produce. White bread became a status symbol. It represented modernity, cleanliness, the future. Bakeries that still sold dark, coarse loaves were seen as old-fashioned, even unsanitary. Advertisements featured children with glowing skin holding perfect white squares. Mothers were told this was purity, that the whiter the bread, the safer it was for their families. The method was simple. Take whole wheat, remove the bran, remove the germ, keep only the endosperm, the starchy center that grinds into fine, pale flour. The result was soft, uniform, and lasted for weeks without spoiling. It was everything the market wanted. What it wasn't was food in the way food had been understood before. Whole wheat contains fiber, B vitamins, iron, magnesium, zinc, and vitamin E. The bran and germ hold nearly all of the grain's nutritional value. When those parts are removed, what remains is mostly starch and a small amount of protein. The milling process effectively turned wheat into a vehicle for calories with almost nothing else attached. But the bread didn't disappear, it multiplied. It showed up in every grocery store, every school cafeteria, every hospital tray. It became the foundation of the American sandwich, the default option, the thing you didn't have to think about. It was just there. And because it was there, it was eaten 3 times a day, sometimes more. Toast for breakfast, sandwiches for lunch, dinner rolls on the side. The average American was consuming multiple servings of refined white flour every single day, often without realizing that the food they were eating had been stripped of the very things that made it nourishing. By the 1940s, the United States government noticed something troubling. Rates of pellagra, beriberi, and anemia were climbing, particularly among low-income populations. These were diseases of deficiency, the kind that appeared when people weren't getting enough B vitamins or iron, the kind that had been rare when people ate whole grains. The response was not to bring back whole wheat, it was to fortify white bread. Synthetic vitamins were added back into the flour. Thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, and iron became mandatory additives. The bread was now enriched, a term that suggested improvement, even though what really happened was a partial restoration of what had been removed in the first place. It was as if someone had taken your wallet, returned a few bills, and called it a gift. The fortification worked in a narrow sense. Pellagra rates dropped, beriberi became uncommon again, but the fiber was still gone. The magnesium, the zinc, the vitamin E, the dozens of phytonutrients present in whole grains, none of those came back. And the habit had already set in. People were now eating a food that looked like bread, tasted like bread, and was called bread, but functioned in the body more like sugar. Bread was only the beginning. Once the model was established, refine the food, remove the nutrition, add back a fraction, market it as modern, it spread to nearly every other staple. Rice was polished until it turned white. Pasta was made from refined semolina. Breakfast cereals were puffed, sweetened, and stripped of bran. Even oatmeal, one of the simplest whole foods, was increasingly sold in instant form, pre-cooked and often pre-sweetened, with much of its fiber content reduced. The language around these products was always the same: faster, cleaner, better. Convenience became synonymous with progress, and progress meant moving away from anything that looked too close to its original form. Whole wheat bread, when it was sold at all, was marketed as a specialty item. Health food stores carried it. It cost more. It went stale faster. It wasn't soft. To most people, it seemed like a downgrade, a return to something primitive. The industrial version had become so normalized that the original now seemed like the alternative. But the body doesn't process refined grains the way it processes whole ones. When you eat whole wheat, the fiber slows digestion. Glucose is released gradually. Insulin rises and falls in a controlled rhythm. The vitamins and minerals are absorbed alongside the carbohydrates, supporting cellular function, energy production, and metabolic balance. When you eat white bread, the glucose hits fast. There's little fiber to slow it down. Blood sugar spikes, insulin surges to manage the flood, and an hour later, blood sugar crashes, triggering hunger again. The cycle repeats, often multiple times a day, for years. This is not a dramatic process. It doesn't announce itself. There's no single meal that breaks the system. It's cumulative. It's the same refined carbohydrates every day, for decades, in a body that was never designed to handle that kind of load. By the 1970s, rates of obesity in the United States began to climb. Not gradually, sharply. The percentage of adults classified as obese doubled between 1960 and 1980. It doubled again by the year 2000. Type 2 diabetes, once considered a disease of older adults, began appearing in teenagers. Heart disease became the leading cause of death. There were many factors: sedentary lifestyles, increased portion sizes, the rise of fast food. But underneath all of it was a baseline diet built on refined grains and added sugars, foods that had replaced their whole nutrient-dense predecessors without anyone stopping to ask what the long-term cost might be. The human body is resilient. It can adapt to a lot. But adaptation is not the same as thriving. People were full but malnourished. They were eating enough calories, often more than enough, but missing the micronutrients that regulate metabolism, support immune function, and maintain hormonal balance. It was a new kind of deficiency, one that didn't look like starvation but produced its own set of chronic conditions. And it was everywhere. The effects didn't show up in a single generation. They compounded. Children who grew up eating refined grains in the 1950s became adults in the 1970s. They fed their own children the same foods, not out of neglect, but because those foods were normal. White bread, sugary cereals, pasta made from refined flour. These were the default options. Whole grains, if they were considered at all, were niche, optional, something only particularly health-conscious people sought out. By the 1990s, metabolic syndrome had a name. It described a cluster of conditions: high blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, excess abdominal fat, and abnormal cholesterol that often appeared together and dramatically increased the risk of heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. The syndrome didn't have a single cause, but diet was central. And at the center of that diet were refined carbohydrates. The connection wasn't hidden. Researchers had been documenting it for decades. Studies showed that diets high in refined grains and sugars were linked to insulin resistance, weight gain, and inflammation. Whole grains, by contrast, were consistently associated with lower rates of chronic disease. But the food system had already been built. The infrastructure was in place. Factories were optimized for refining. Supply chains were designed around shelf-stable, processed products. Changing course would have required dismantling an entire industry. So instead, the conversation shifted. The problem, people were told, was fat. In the 1980s, dietary fat became the villain. Low-fat diets were recommended by major health organizations. Fat was removed from products and replaced with sugar and refined carbohydrates. skim milk, low-fat yogurt, fat-free cookies, all of it marketed as healthier, even though the replacements were often worse. The result was predictable. People ate less fat and more carbohydrates, particularly refined ones, and the rates of obesity and diabetes continued to climb. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the focus began to shift back. Researchers began emphasizing the quality of carbohydrates, not just their quantity. The glycemic index became a topic of public discussion. Whole grains were recommended again, though by then generations had grown up without them. Even now, the average American eats less than 1 serving of whole grains per day. Most people consume 6 or more servings of refined grains. The gap between what is recommended and what is eaten remains vast, not because people don't care, but because the system is built to make refined grains the easier choice. They're cheaper, they're everywhere, they last longer. They're what people grew up eating. And changing a food culture is harder than changing a single habit. There's a photograph from 1925 of a bakery in Brooklyn. The shelves are lined with dark loaves, round and irregular, crusted with flour. The baker stands in the back, hands dusted white, next to a wood-fired oven. The bread in that photograph would be unrecognizable in most American grocery stores today. Not because it's old-fashioned, because it's whole. Somewhere in the century that followed, the definition of bread changed. It stopped being a food made from grain, water, salt, and thyme, and became a product made from refined flour, preservatives, dough conditioners, and added sugars. The ingredient list expanded, the nutrition label shrank, and people stopped knowing what bread was supposed to be. This isn't about nostalgia, it's about baseline. There was a version of bread that had been eaten for thousands of years across nearly every culture that grew grain. It was made from the entire seed. It was dense, flavorful, and filling. It didn't need a label because there was nothing to list. That version still exists, but it's no longer the default. You have to look for it. You have to pay more for it. You have to know it's different. Most people don't. The normalization was so complete that the industrial version became invisible. It wasn't seen as a deviation, it was just bread. And because it was just bread, it wasn't questioned. But the body kept track. The human digestive system evolved over millions of years to process whole foods. Grains with their bran intact, fruits with their fiber, vegetables with their skins. The enzymes, the gut bacteria, the entire metabolic process developed in response to foods that were complex, that took time to break down, that came with everything the body needed to process them. Refined grains are new. Not new in the sense of decades, new in the sense of a blip in evolutionary time. The body encounters them and does what it can. It breaks them down, it absorbs the glucose, it releases insulin. But it wasn't designed for this. Not at the speed, not at this volume, not day after day for a lifetime. And slowly, the system begins to resist. Insulin receptors become less responsive. The pancreas has to produce more insulin to achieve the same effect. Blood sugar stays elevated longer. Fat accumulates around the organs. Inflammation becomes chronic. This is what metabolic dysfunction looks like. It's not a single disease, it's a slow unraveling of the processes that regulate energy, growth, and repair. And it all starts with what was eaten. Not once, not occasionally, every day for years. There's a quiet realization that comes with understanding this. It's not anger exactly, it's something closer to betrayal. The sense that the most basic things, bread, rice, cereal, were changed without consent, and that the consequences were absorbed by millions of people who never knew there had been a choice. The food was always there, it was trusted, It was normal. And normal, it turns out, is the most effective disguise. The story of refined grains is not just a story about bread. It's a story about what happens when nutrition becomes optional, when profit drives the process, when an entire population is fed a version of food that looks like the original but functions differently in the body. It's a story that's still unfolding. This was just one ingredient.